Hi, I'm Deborah Cohen. I'm a history professor and the director of the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. It is a complete joy to introduce Maria Lipman, Masha Lipman. Lipman is one of the most astute and experienced observers of Russian politics writing in English today. A political analyst and commentator whose work centers on state-society relations, media, the politics of history in Russia, among many other subjects. She has spent 3 decades writing for and editing major Russian and English language publications, including a decade of commentary in the Washington Post and 5 years contributing to the New Yorker online. Her recent essays in foreign affairs, including Forever Putinism, the Russian autocrat's answer to the problem of succession, and another recent essay, Exiles Cannot Save Russia, reflect what I think is a rare ability to explain Russian politics for international audiences without simplifying what is genuinely complex. She joined us this winter as the Roberta Buffett Visiting Professor of International Studies, and we are really delighted to have her today with us for this event. So Masha will speak first, and then she will be joined in conversation by Professor Ian Hurd. Ian Hurd is Professor of Political Science here, as well as Director of the Roberta Buffett International Studies Program, as well as President of the Faculty Senate. He's got many hats. In his prize-winning scholarship, including After Anarchy and How to Do Things with International Law, both of which were published by Princeton, Professor Hurd examines how international law and institutions, rather than being neutral constraints on state behavior, instead function as instruments of political power and legitimacy. So as I said, thank you so much for joining Masha today, and we will get the program started. It's lovely to see so many of you here. So thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for this very generous introduction. Thank you, Ian. Thank you all for coming. The large-scale invasion of Ukraine over 4 years ago, followed by political protests, the largest of them in Moscow and St. Petersburg. After thousands of protesters have been wrapped up and detained, the protests subsided. A bit later, a critical mass of the protesting constituency, most of them educated liberal urbanites, fled from Russia. Some of them sought to escape inevitable repressions. Others were driven by moral outrage over Russia invading its closest neighbor. Many have since come back. Those who left and stayed amount to about 600,000 to 800,000, a negligible amount compared to the Russian population. I'm going to speak about the Russian people who have not left. And so here's one more in St. Petersburg. I'm going to speak about their mindset in the face of the war in Ukraine, the radical breakaway from the West, and the transformation of Russia into a hard authoritarian militarized state. In a nutshell, people in Russia have not gotten in the way of Putin's policy and have demonstrated a habitual, in fact, perennial capacity to adapt. This capacity is commonly described as submissiveness. I prefer to describe it as resilience. I'm going to cite some polling data in my talk, despite the understandable skepticism regarding polling in Russia at this time. I believe that dismissing this data is unwise. In fact, polling data, I think, today are especially important as Russian people have become barely reachable for scholars and journalists, either Western or their Russian colleagues who found themselves in exile. It is also advisable to compensate this scarcity of reporting by the background knowledge about the Russian public perception. And by the way, even in response to the proverbial question about the approval of the special military operation, of course, the way it is mandated, the Russian government mandated to refer to the war in Ukraine in Russia, 10 to 12% Russians say point blank that they do not approve of the special military operation, which actually belies the idea that all Russians have been intimidated or have fallen into submission or cynicism. This number is higher, about 14% among the Russian young, those between 18 and 24 years old. Just very recently, a group of Russian loyalists applied for a government grant intended to foster patriotism among school children. In their application, they wrote that up to half of young Russians do not support the special military operation. Of course, they use the statistics to sound more persuasive so as to procure more funds from the government. But it's noteworthy that they feel appropriate to use this argument. Professional interpretation of polling data, including in-depth interviews and focus groups, now more than before calls for taking into account the knowledge and understanding of the Russian society accumulated over the 3 decades of unconstrained sociological research conducted by Russian scholars, often jointly with their Western colleagues. So the question should be, what shapes the public perception in Russia and how one should interpret the broad acceptance of the war by the Russian people? When discussing public perceptions of a topic as vast and complex as war, one should resist the urge to reduce it to a simple yes or no. It is reasonable to suggest that it's elements of both, as well as several other things, such as patriotism and loyalty to one's own against the enemy, sympathy for those fighting at the front while you and yours are safe, or genuine anti-Western sentiments, and much more. We should also bear in mind the role of social differences, including the urban-rural divide, geographic factors. Some regions in Russia, first and foremost, Belgorod region, has found itself on the front line. Also, generational differences, as I mentioned, younger people tend to be less approving of the war. Also, economic disparities. And to this, I would add the factor of employment. The state sector has grown quite substantially in Russia, and especially during the years of the war, since the invasion. And up to half employed in the state sector, more often than not, have job security and high salaries. In the rest of my talk, I will talk about various instances of public reactions to unwelcome or welcome changes of habitual environment over the post-Soviet decades, which I hope might add important nuance to the Russians' attitude to the war and the general mood in Russia today. Here's an example from the early 1992. Back then, Russia's first post-Soviet government launched economic reforms, liberalizing prices, and a transition to a market economy, which quickly caused consumer prices to skyrocket, even for basic food staples. The CIA published a special report predicting mass protests in Russia in the winter of 1992. The then CIA director, Robert Gates, based on his agency's report, stated that the coming winter would witness, I quote, a most significant social disorder. Michael Dobbs, the Moscow correspondent for the then glorious Washington Post, was skeptical of the CIA assessment. I worked at the time in the Washington Post Moscow Bureau as a translator and researcher, and I remember Michael Dobbs being firmly convinced that he had very reliable signs that there would be no public protests in Russia. His firsthand experience and understanding of Russia and Russians enabled him to make better judgment than the entire CIA's intelligence expertise. He proved right. And later that year, in early March 1992, he reported, and I quote here his article of the time, "Russia, much touted winter of discontent has so far failed to materialize." Russian people adapted. They adapted to the hardship as well as to the fledgling, or should I say wild, market economy in Russia. The 1990s, and especially the early 1990s, were the time of disorientation and confusion. The rise of crime, the collapse of the habitual safety net, the impoverishment, but that did not lead to mass protests. Not that the Russian people did not have the experience of rallying. We're talking about very, very early 90s. In fact, the couple of years preceding the liberal economic reforms were the time when Russian people were infatuated with politics. The rallies that took place just prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union were gigantic. Mostly they were against the Communist Party and the dictate and the dominant role of the Communist Party, but some were even in defense of the communist system and the Soviet Union which was about to collapse. Many among the Russian, still Soviet people at that time, this was just prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, were inspired by ideas of freedom from the Communist Party dictate and by dreams of a bright democratic future. People at large at that time believed they could and should make a difference and acted on that belief peacefully and en masse. Russia has a history of violent mutinies, but a broad public movement driven by hopes for change was truly unique. The sense of empowerment and political optimism of 1990 and 91 ended very soon after the Soviet Union collapsed and new political forces took charge. Russian history at large is that of an omnipotent state, often ferocious and merciless, and a powerless people. This is why attacking the state head-on is broadly and habitually believed to be unwise and unadvisable. Historically, a more rational tactic has been to adapt to the state-dominated environment and to the extent that it is possible to carve out a secure and comfortable place for yourself and your loved ones. The liberal economic reforms launched in 1992 caught the Russian people unawares and hit them really hard. In the 1990s, and especially in the early 1990s, there was a choice of political parties and elections were free. In the parliamentary elections of that decade, the pro-government, pro-Kremlin forces lost. In 1993, to the party of nationalist buffoon Vladimir Zhirinovsky, in 1995, to the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. It may be argued that the majority of those who voted against the Kremlin and against the pro-Kremlin party scarcely expected their votes to make a difference. Indeed, it did not. But voting against the Kremlin enabled people to let off steam. Meanwhile, they responded to hardship in the way Russians have traditionally done, not by protesting, but by adapting as best they could to the new and inauspicious socioeconomic environment. The first post-Soviet decade was broadly referred to as the wild 90s. During that decade, the state remained weakened, but the people were not empowered either. When things began to improve in the 2000s, in the first decade of 2000s, this was not the result of political participation, whether in the form of street protests or democratic procedure. Rather, the state reconstituted itself and rose to the task of stabilization. This was the first decade of Vladimir Putin's leadership. Putin realized the public frustration and bitterness, and he did what any sane politician would do in his place. He changed the course and delivered the yearned for stability instead of chaos. His immense stroke of luck, the steadily growing price of oil, enabled him to also deliver growing prosperity to the impoverished nation. The wild 90s gave way to the fat 2000s, also the way that decade is commonly referred to in Russia. And this was arguably the best period in the Russian history ever, as far as people's well-being and the state-society relations are concerned. A majority enjoyed rising living standards and new lifestyle opportunities. The entrepreneurial class was enriching itself, taking advantage of the favorable economic environment. The liberals enjoyed freedom of self-expression in social initiatives, clubs, etc. They also had their own media and were free to reach out to their limited audience of like-minded liberals. Boris Dubin, an insightful Russian sociologist, described Russia of the 2000s as the state that does not intrude. It sounds very good in Russian for those who know it, государство, которое не достает. The fat 2000s were a good time, but they were not a period of people's empowerment. Instead, amidst the general contentment and complacency, Putin's government pursued its own course unencumbered and steadily consolidated state power. This course included the establishment of full control over national television, a virtual elimination of federalism in Russia and replacement of elected governors by appointed ones, a consolidation of control over extractive industries, a marginalization of opposition parties, and much more. Those alarmed by the rapidly consolidating state control sought to organize public protests, but those rallies brought together dozens of people, up to a couple hundred if the organizers were lucky. Life was good, politics was uninteresting, and Putin enjoyed a free hand. This peaceful coexistence, the mutual non-intrusion, was interrupted by political protests in 2011 and 2012. The protests were organized by liberal urbanites, mostly in Moscow, but also in other large urban centers. The rallies created an enthusiastic atmosphere for the participants and their sympathizers, but politically, they were hardly a threat to the Kremlin. The government reaction, nevertheless, was unequivocal and harsh. The Kremlin reminded the nation that it would not tolerate public interference into its own domain, that is, politics and policymaking. The public at large was generally not supportive of the government crackdown. About 2/3 disapproved, but neither did people sympathize with the protests and the protesters. Only about 22% of Russians approved the protest, while a majority was either indifferent or wary. The next decade, the 2010s, brought to the fore a different kind of public protests, socioeconomic in nature, smaller, strictly localized, and more tenacious. The participants raised much more concrete demands, and sometimes those demands were even met. Here are a couple examples. In 2018, a powerful movement against the construction of a landfill took place in the province of Arkhangelsk in the Russian north. The standoff lasted for over 1 year, and in the end, the landfill was not built. Another example has to do with a protest in Moscow. And that one was against the construction of a church in a Moscow public park called Tarfyanka. It lasted off and on from 2015 till 2021, and eventually the church was not built. What distinguishes those rallies is that people protested over encroachment on their own immediate people's spaces, spaces in inverted commas, because it was either the landfill or clean air, but people thought of those spaces as theirs. None of those protests ventured into the realm of high national politics, which Russians had long deferred to the Kremlin, the state, or Putin. Since Putin's first term, the Kremlin primary policy toward the public has been to ensure that people would not be a hurdle and Putin would have unconstrained power of decision-making. This was a policy of social demobilization effectively implemented by savvy Kremlin aides, and it was broadly accepted by the Russian people at large. After the protest wave of 2011 and 12, and that protest wave had been suppressed, the social demobilization pattern largely remained in place, but new elements were added to the Kremlin's policy vis-a-vis the people. Those were elements of ideological nature, including forceful promotion of patriotism and Russia's greatness across centuries, as well as the so-called traditional values, first and foremost, anti-Western and anti-LGBTQ messaging. Also included in this ideological framework was persistent condemnation of Russian liberals as a pro-Western fifth column. They were also condemned as traitors who did not adhere to traditional Russian values. The Kremlin's policy vis-a-vis the society generally avoided going against the grain and refrained from imposing on people what they would be disinclined to believe. Instead, the Kremlin aides tend to tap into the existing perceptions and reinforce those perceptions using their own means. The anti-Western and anti-gay sentiments fall in this category. Russian people are disinclined to think of those who govern them as conscientious officials motivated by concern for the public good. They are not at all shy to criticize the inequality and corruption and to see those up above as thieving and careless and enriching themselves at people's expense. It was this perception that attracted millions of Russians to Alexei Navalny's videos in which he exposed the corruption of the powers that be. Navalny collectively referred to the Russian bosses as swindlers and thieves, and that formula easily stuck with his very broad audience. Every few years, Levada pollsters, Levada is the largest and veteran polling agency in Russia, the non-government one. And every year, they include in their survey the question of whose interests does Putin represent? Russian respondents never put ordinary people as Putin's #1 priority, not even #2 or 3. So as you see in this slide, they come as #4 and sometimes as #5. Samuel Green, American sociologist, and in my view, one of the most insightful analysts of the Russian society, wrote a few years ago, and I quote, "General quiescence coexists with a deep-seated antipathy toward the country's ruling elite." This perception may apply to governors, ministers, administrators of various levels. Putin, however, belongs in a category of his own. He is regarded as a symbol of state power, upholding its greatness and pride and protecting Russia against its enemies. Samuel Green characterizes the underlying tectonics of Russians, his wording, and their relations with their state as, I quote, "their preparedness to see it as simultaneously dysfunctional and yet legitimate, unjust and yet worthy. Indeed, the state is seen as worthy, indeed indispensable as a bulwark of Russia's national interests. In today's Russia, as a country at war, this function has become even more important. Russians entrust their country, its greatness and pride, and its stature on the global scene with the state and Putin as the leader who embodies it. When the war began in 2022, the social demobilization pattern was still in place. But about 6 months into the war, by September 2022, the negative developments at the front forced Putin to call what was referred to as partial mobilization. This was a radical departure from the 2 decades-long policy of social demobilization. And the Kremlin immediately faced the consequences. Young Russian men responded by running away as best they could from the danger, from the risk of being called to fight and from the risk of being called. Putin promptly wrapped up that policy, and the Kremlin returned to the familiar pattern of social demobilization. Instead of forced military mobilization, the government has offered generous monetary compensation for those who volunteered to fight, and it has also offered freedom to convicts who chose to risk their lives instead of serving their prison terms. It's been 3.5 years since the military mobilization, and despite abominable losses, Putin has firmly refrained from calling it again, even though rumors have it that he was repeatedly pushed or begged, or whatever the right word is, by the military commanders. It is noteworthy that while emphasizing unity and patriotism of the Russian people vis-a-vis the external threats, Putin refrained from mentioning, let alone condemning, those who had fled back in the fall of 2022. Social demobilization implies that Russians surrender responsibility for important political matters. A striking illustration is people's reaction to Yevgeny Prigozhin's armed mutiny in the summer of 2023. Prigozhin was the founder and leader of the Wagner Group, a Russian private military company, which used to play a prominent role in the war in Ukraine. He had engaged in a bitter conflict with the leadership of the Russian armed forces, the defense minister, and the chief of general staff. And in the summer of 23, the standoff between Prigozhin and those two men escalated into an open rebellion when Prigozhin led the heavily armed men in an armored column toward Moscow in what he called a march of justice. The armed convoy rapidly advanced, met no resistance, and seized the headquarters of the Southern Military District in the city of Rostov-on-Don, a city of over 1 million people. As local residents gathered to gawk at the mutineers, their dominant attitude was neither fear nor outrage, nor sympathy for Prigozhin's rebellion. Rather, the attitude was that of amused curiosity. Prigozhin halted the advance and never made it to Moscow, and later that summer he was killed in a plane crash, widely believed to have been orchestrated by the Kremlin. There was barely any public reaction to Prigozhin's death as well, neither celebration nor mourning. Apparently, Russians viewed both the mutiny and the liquidation of the mutineers as their business, not ours. The war is undoubtedly disturbing and disquieting, but ordinary Russians, first and foremost, those in large urban centers, are still capable, arguably even encouraged, to avert their gaze, to turn their backs on the war and avoid discussing the developments on the battlefield. Ample historical evidence shows that normalizing the abnormal is human, and large cities have better capacity for normalization. And while Russia is waging a devastating war on its neighbor, normalization has been encouraged and abetted by the state itself. In focus groups, respondents often say these days that the only thing worse than war is the lost war. They rely on Putin to prevent this worst case scenario from happening. Meanwhile, as the war has ended its 5th year, polls have shown a growing fatigue. Only a quarter Russians would like the fighting to go on, while at least 2/3 are in favor of peace talks. But much as Russians would love to see the war end, they remain convinced that this does not depend on them. In February this year, the Kremlin radicalized its clampdown on the internet. The actual restrictions have been the case for a few years now, but now the authorities early this year began throttling and degrading a Telegram app nationwide. March and April saw near outages and plans to full restriction, all-out assaults on VPNs. State-controlled pollsters reported that Putin's approval rating have been steadily declining for several straight weeks. The decline, one shouldn't think that it is a decline to something like 20 or 30%. The decline was from over 70% to over 60%. But these reports, and that's interesting because I'm talking not just of Levada Polling Agency, which is a private organization, but also the two major state-controlled and state-owned polling firms. Not only were they reporting those events, but Russian media, and I mean the loyal one, the Russian media in Russia, were further publicizing the decline of Putin's rating. April saw an unusual rise of verbal discontent, mostly over the clampdown on the internet, but also over economic problems. In mid-April, public expressions of discontent over the internet restrictions began to appear more and more. A Russian influencer recorded a video from her home in Monaco, of all places, in which he addressed Putin personally and said that people were afraid of him and he didn't know the whole truth. She also mentioned the blockage of the internet among the most urgent problems. Her video collected 30 million views. Billionaire Vladimir Potadin, one of Russia's 3 richest men, gave a television interview in which he cautiously pointed out that research and development was badly in need of internet freedom. The leader of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, in his own Telegram channel, passionately condemned the government agency in charge of digitalization for its intention to levy additional charges for foreign internet traffic. Russian military bloggers, pro-war online commentators who frequently criticize the way the Russian military wage war in Ukraine have been especially bitter lately over the blockage of Telegram. A member of the Kremlin administration was quoted as saying, "Our society is tired of the language of prohibition. It is no longer possible to issue more bans." These are just a few of recent manifestations of discontent. Some commentators, Western as well as Russian commentators in exile, began to discuss the weakening of Putin and the prospects of destabilization of his regime. Although the rising discontent can be denied, I tend to be more skeptical. The radical tightening of the internet restrictions has triggered public discontent because many Russians saw it as an encroachment on their own space, not unlike the mentioned construction of a landfill or a church in a Moscow park. "I'm sick of it all" has become a common line in focus groups. Again, for those of you who know Russian, "надоело это все." All of this implies internet shutdown, rising prices, and no end to the war. But focus group participants stop short of criticizing the war itself. They just say that they're sick of it all. Like the protesters against the landfill and the construction of a church, the protesters are generally loyal and don't criticize the government at large or Putin in particular. The policy of the past years, which combines repression, ideological messaging, and generous compensation to those who go to fight, has worked to assure almost total loyalty to the state. But apparently, Russians still expect that their state will not encroach on their own personal space or deprive them of what they believe to be theirs. Putin's government of 2026 is much more repressive than it was back a few years ago. And what we see is grumbling, not protesting. Small concessions regarding internet shutdowns, and especially the crackdown on VPNs, might be expected, but there is no reason to expect a softening or the broader policy of internet restrictions, or more generally, of Putin's repressive course. Nor should one expect the war in Ukraine to end soon. I don't think anyone at this point can predict just how much longer the war will continue. To conclude, here's a quote from an unnamed member of the elite. This is the only way people in the Russian government are close to it or close to business circles are quoted in Western media these days, or Russian media for that matter. So an unnamed member of the Russian elite, cited in last week's piece by the New Yorker magazine journalist Joshua Yaffe, said, "Sure, people may be nervous, uncertain, even gloomy, but talk of an immediate threat to Putin's rule is overblown. It is a fiction that should be read not as analysis, but as an attempt at informational warfare." So this is the end of the quote from the unnamed member of the elite. And I would suggest to interpret those expectations as an exercise in wishful thinking. The unnamed member of the elite also continued to say that Putin retains full control. Any notion to the contrary is nonsense. I will end with a very, very recent poll published just a few days ago, asking people who they would vote for if the presidential election were held next Sunday. The results were 49% for Putin versus 1% or less for every other candidate on the list. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's a delightful introduction to the themes. I wanted to get back to some of the themes that you brought up at the very beginning regarding how to think about understanding polls and focus groups coming out of this context. So I gather you're not suggesting that we take literally the numbers. How do you want us to interpret that sort of data?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. This is a question that is very often asked. I think one thing about public opinion polling is we do not learn what people think. We know what they say. This is important, and this matters not only in Russia as a authoritarian state, but anywhere. And when people give an answer, and especially when they give an answer to something that is not a matter of their immediate experience, like, well, do you think the prices have gone up? Do you think your life has become better economically? This is something people experience, and they have thought and spoke about it. But when they asked questions about high politics, including foreign affairs, including global politics, they don't have their immediate experience. They are based on somebody else's opinion, something they heard, on somebody they trust. It may be television, it may be their friends, it may be somebody, a commentator that they prefer to others, but this is very important to remember. And people also adjust their opinion to what they think is the right way, the appropriate way of thinking in their milieu. This is true in this country as well as any other country, and it is also true of Russia. Now, of course, if we look at the numbers of do you approve of the special military operation, and if we look at just one number, it tells you nothing. What matters very much is dynamic. And while the answer to this particular question has barely changed since the beginning of the war, there is plenty of dynamic when you ask other questions. And the matter of, the matter of interpretation and professional interpretation is very, very important. We as laymen cannot make sensible conclusions, and especially about the nation not our own, if we just look at the numbers. This makes the interpretation of pollsters, and especially those pollsters who also do focus groups, who talk to the actual people and see their reaction and see how people react to each other's opinions and how they try to adjust, which is always happening. And when they write about it, I would trust Russian pollsters. When it comes to what I was talking about, which was unusual, and many observers noticed that it was government pollsters that were publishing week after week the data showing that Putin's approval rating was going down. There may be a political interest there. And it was indeed interpreted as doves with huge quotation marks trying to play against the hawks, which is the FSB, the Russian state security, the omnipotent agency, which is seen to be behind the clampdown on the internet. So that was probably the fact that they published the rating. That's what their timid attempt to somehow influence Putin's decisions, to get through to him, to show that people are unhappy, and maybe the state security agency is going too far. But that was not all. And I mean, the results published by state-controlled pollsters was not all we saw. What I mentioned, political figures saying something that didn't say before, created an atmosphere in which it was easier to interpret the polling data. So in a nutshell, not a single one number, not a single one poll, not a single one survey gives you an idea, but keeping track, following week after week, month after month, year after year, enables a professional to assess and to give shrewd and I would say reliable assessment of how people feel.
So it sounds like that you do have some faith that we can, well, can we reach the understandings of people, or is the interpretation of the sort of elite games and sects and factions that's being revealed in that sort of data?
What I meant was people have become unreachable for journalists. As I'm sure all of you know, There are almost no foreign reporters in Moscow these days, something actually unprecedented. There were foreign reporters in Russia even during Stalin's times, but most of them left as soon as the war began after the Russian government passed a new piece of legislation, which was called the Law Against Fake News, which basically was a requirement to whatever you're writing, whatever you are broadcasting, to repeat the government wordings for anything related to the war. And foreign correspondents and foreign reporters bureaus in Russia, they realized that they would be in breach of the Russian law because repeating the government wording, repeating the government language is not what they're there for. And they simply left. And of course, lots and lots of, it is also unprecedented just how many journalists in entire newsrooms left Russia, which means that the Russian people have become unreachable, not the public opinion, but it is no longer possible to do what actually reporters call vox pop. Walk along a street, stop a person, ask him or her opinion about what they think about this or that. This is impossible, just impossible. There's only one person left, and this is a veteran BBC reporter who does television reportage, but you know, you can tell how timid those reports are. Also scholars, I mean sociologists. There were so many brilliant sociologists working in Russia. And there was brilliant work done in cooperation between Western sociologists and Russian sociologists. And their work was unconstrained for the during the post-Soviet decades. This is no longer possible. And what I said, what I meant was that this makes polling data so precious. Maybe not always take it at face value. Maybe we need to depend even more than usual on those who interpret those results professionally. But this was my point, that one shouldn't dismiss, and especially early on, I heard this all the time. I mean, what polling data? Do you expect people to tell a pollster what they truly think? Of course not, because they can go to jail for that, but apparently no. And you know, the number of those who say that they do not approve of the special military operation in polls is not negligible. 14% is not so little, actually. And 10 to 12 on the average, 14% among the young. So people still think that they can say what they think to a pollster. It is just that we depend much more on experienced pollsters, on savvy analysts who have done this for years and maybe decades. And especially to me, what is important is when polling numbers are complemented by the results of focus groups. Because in focus groups, people begin to talk. This is the genre, this is the format that make people talk. They find themselves among people like themselves. And you know, somebody voices an opinion and others want to agree or disagree. Otherwise, you know, you wouldn't keep silent for an hour and a half at a focus group lasts. People talk. And a seasoned pollster can feel the difference. And this is what they started writing. That this phrase, "I'm sick of it all," has repeated itself day after day, focus group after focus groups. And this actually began a few months ago, early this year.
And so it sounds like you're suggesting that we should be very attuned to, if not hearing people actually speak through reporters, but to the evidence of grumbling and perhaps even escalating to protests. It was very interesting, your distinction between local protests and how those are handled and those that have national significance. Is it your sense that this is a strategic choice that the authorities are using to allow some local, or to be more tolerant of local as a way to understand what people are aggrieved by?
Totally. Of course, this was rational, but this was also 6, 7 years ago. And these days, to me, what is important in what I was saying was that the encroachment on the internet is an encroachment on your own world. This is yours. This is not the war. This is not big politics. This is not elections. Have it all. Please, that's yours. I understand that. but my world is my world. And despite the government having become much more repressive, there's still a sense that, I have a right. This is not something that's articulated, but I think there's this feeling that this is mine. And when the state begins to encroach, I feel indignation, or at least I want to grumble, and I want others, I find others around me grumble too, because this is what everyone experiences. With the internet, it's important that, of course, the internet is a medium, not sure which word to use here, that is not equally needed or used in an equal manner by all. The groups affected the most are the more educated, the wealthier, and the younger. So the first two categories both are wealthy and separate from the bulk of the society. According to some estimates, this is a group that amounts to about 20%. The young, the wealthy, the well-educated. This, I think, makes it possible for the government to expect that the bulk of the population will actually reconcile with the clampdown and with the restrictions. It's not that the government cuts off people from the World Wide Web. They try to cut them off from foreign sources, from the sources that do not repeat the Kremlin propaganda. They have, the government launched its own app that should replace Telegram. And it's not that people will be completely cut off. It's just that because it's new and because the government has hastily working on it, it's of inferior quality. But for a majority of the Russian population, they will gradually adjust, no question about that. For the minority, well, this is why I said that I would not rule out that the government will make small concessions. And one of the ways may be new additional charge for the use of international traffic. This is doable, and the government already kind of announced that it might do that. It hasn't yet, and it seems that the pertinent government bodies are not yet ready to introduce a system that would charge people specifically extra charge for internet traffic. I think the expectations are that few people will actually be willing or able to pay for it, and this would reduce the number of those who would have access to a broader internet world and will not remain in the constraints that the government has imposed. So this is complicated, but again, what is important to me here is that it's a kind of a local protest or a local grumbling. And this is what enables me to compare it to the protest against encroaching into my space, my park. I love this park. This is where I take my pets for a walk, my children. This is where I live. I make friends. It's important to me. And suddenly there is this church which was a government project, actually, Moscow government project, and they hated it because that would deprive them of the space where they enjoyed their own life. And this was a space in the very narrow sense of the word. Same about the landfill. This is my clean air. And I hate the government for the intention of building a landfill there. Same with the internet. Okay, constraints, the economy is not in great shape. I can adjust, I can adapt, but I have my world. I'm not talking about professionals who use the internet for their professional purposes, very sophisticated internet experts. I'm talking about people who are sophisticated enough or interested in a broader information world. And it may be, entertainment. It may be having fun. It may be playing games. But I don't want the government to encroach in my space. And I think the government may be partly understanding and maybe may make some concessions.
I have one more question before we open it up to comments. I wonder if I could ask you to turn the story around. Your theme has been how to understand what people are thinking and doing. What does this look like, do you think, in the Kremlin or for Putin? You've described where, the great strength that produces such fear in people. But that also hints at a kind of anxiety and fear in the Kremlin too. So what do you think that Putin is afraid of in reaction to the forces that you're talking about?
Well, first thing I would like to say is the Kremlin aides are very savvy. And as I mentioned, they do not try, or in as much as they can't avoid it, they do not try, they have not tried to impose on people what people are unwilling to believe. Hence, the anti-gay propaganda, they knew, and there are reasons, and they were right, that people will accept that, people at large. And the anti-Western sentiments, they knew that people would respond to that, and that for a majority, this is a perception that they would think of as their own. They would eagerly, readily share that. But there are things that they would not do, which also fall into more or less the same sphere. What Putin is afraid of, well, as an uncontested and unchallenged leader of 25 plus years, I think he is concerned with keeping this kind of relationship with his people uncontested and unchallenged. He still has it, as the numbers that I cited at the very end. So this polling question, who would you vote for president? And people do not even think of anybody else. He's been there for 26 years. Right? So he is, well, I think it's too late to use that word about him, but I think since the very beginning, he was a control freak. And he wanted, his sense was there shouldn't be any expression of discontent. So slowly, he has taken the Russian public under control. And when you rule by control, not by any other way, control is never enough. It would seem that he shouldn't be concerned about his standing vis-a-vis the Russian people with a popularity approval rating much higher, many times higher than anybody else's, but he is. And he relies on the Kremlin aid, and they have done a good job for him, and they've been mostly successful, and they would not try to impose too hard on people what they wouldn't know. And one example would be, there is a broad government propaganda about having more children and having children earlier. You hear a lot about, how it is important, of course, at the same time, Putin is sending people to die, and as we recently knew, over 350,000 people have been killed since the beginning of the war. Russian servicemen. But at the same time, he talks about how important it is to be concerned about how large a nation we are. But this doesn't work because Russia is a fairly modernized society. Some 70 or 70+% of people are urban, and they would not give birth to more children because the government says so. And there is very reliable statistics of people in Russia, women in Russia giving birth later in life, after 25, as opposed to before 25. And the younger a person is, the more inclined he and she is to thinking that it is wrong to marry too early and to have children too early. And the government restricts itself to not the propaganda, but to this grandiloquent language, which should be concerned about how many we are. More concrete measures like persuading women not to have an abortion when a woman comes for an abortion. This actually extends to smaller places, provincial places, not big cities. So the government understands where it can press harder and where it cannot. Of course, the war is separate because the war is the government, the Kremlin's, Putin's business. But things that have to do with people's everyday lives, I think the Kremlin is much savvier than that. But the way you ask the question, what is Putin afraid of? Of course, I wouldn't say afraid, he's extremely highly concerned to keep the status of uncontested and unchallenged. And he's been keeping it for 25 years.
Thanks. So we have time for some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, Masha. My name is Tom Melia. I'm visiting Northwestern for a week here as a visiting practitioner from Washington, D.C. I have a question about why people care about the throttling of the internet. Is it because they can't access their cat videos and their online shopping, or is it because you mentioned VPNs in passing, because they can't access the external Russian media that's telling more of the truth about what's going on in the war and in the world than they get from Russian state media outlets?
Thank you. I think I touched upon this a little bit. It's not people at large. I think it's very different. And the number of people who really care about having good access to traffic anywhere amounts to 20%. People use the internet as people use the internet. I mean, people in Russia use the internet pretty much the same way as people do elsewhere. And arguably, most things people do on the internet do not have anything to do with having access to information that is denied to them by the state. You buy on the internet, you get your entertainment on the internet, you reach out to your loved ones, to your friends and relatives. You use the apps to call another city, to call a taxi, to have home delivery of food or whatever. I mean, these days we all live in the internet, and this is not because all of us are eager to get something that the government, I'm talking now about Russia, that the government would want us to bar us from. But such people also exist. I think we should also bear in mind how many professionals there are who need the internet for their work, and not just the internet that is restricted by Russia proper. Entertainment, extremely popular sources such as the Instagram and TikTok have been banned in Russia and were banned already a few years ago. So you need a VPN to actually reach TikTok or Instagram. And I think we all know that these two sources are not necessarily about daring political information. It's all kinds of information. And this is why I'm saying young people, professionals, well-educated people, and wealthier ones, right? What the government is doing, or has announced that it would do, is not only a restriction on Telegram app, which lots and lots of people are using in Russia and elsewhere, but a lot of people in Russia, but the VPNs. And actually the threat or the government planned policy that has announced already is that VPNs will be illegal. Anyone who is using a VPN will be a suspect. How do you do that? People have a VPN. They have it on in their computer. They reach any kind of information, website or whatever, that is okay with the Russian government. But this way, the government can trace that they're using the VPN. They may not be using for this particular person, but they know that it's on. So savvy users these days do this: put the VPN on, put the VPN off, use the VPN when you're reaching something that is unreachable otherwise, but never forget to switch it off when you reach a Russian source, when, I don't know, you order a taxi or whatever, because otherwise you may be trapped. So people with experience say that paid internet traffic, international traffic, will be a way that the government will use to reduce the number of those who still are able and willing and do not mind the effort of going on the World Wide Web worldwide, this is how their number will be reduced. But people need it, and it shouldn't be underestimating just how many people use it for what they do professionally.
Thanks. I want to give a chance for students as well, especially if there are any. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Misha. I was curious. I was thinking that there's an argument to be made that the direction Russia's going with repressions is sort of where Belarus has been over the past decade in terms of control, surveillance, and all of that. And that really hasn't been very effective. Like, I think protests haven't really done much in Belarus. Lukashenko doesn't really care what happens there. Do you think it's more effective in Russia, just generally public unrest, or are there other levels for people sort of pull on to influence the government's decisions?
Thank you for the question. The two countries are very different. And what happened in Belarus when an opposition candidate won an election, actually it was a victory. It was not like somebody sought to run. And Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, actually announced his own victory and then went for an all-out repressions, pushing lots and lots of people from Belarus to immigrate. In Russia, we have never had that. In Russia, we had never had a candidate, self-proclaimed, or a person who actually ran, who was even comparable to Putin in popularity. I think all of you know the name of Alexei Navalny, who was extremely popular as the author of his videos in which he exposed the corruption of the powers that be, but much less popular as a political leader. And when asked whether they would vote for Navalny for president, only a small minority of Russians said that they would, not that they had the opportunity. But in Belarus, their leader actually allowed an opposition candidate to run, knowing, I think, he too, his aides also do public opinion polls. He let an opposition candidate with a fairly good chances to run, and then he was facing a situation when a majority in the country voted for somebody not himself. In Russia, we never had that. And I think Putin ruled out such an opportunity very early on. This is why I'm saying he's been unchallenged and uncontested for, well, he's in power for 26 years, I would say for 25. He enjoyed the status of uncontested and unchallenged. It's a different system. It's a different state. It's very important that Belarus is small, Russia is large. But Putin's obsession for control and his ability to take the whole country under control and to take politics under control very early, very, very early, before actually a real clamp down on public expression, was a wise policy from his perspective, and a savvy and a very successful one. So there was no need for mass repressions of the kind that Lukashenko launched in his country. Those who dare protest since 2012, the first time a peaceful protest was, people were roughed up and arrested and jailed. This only happened in 2012. And since then, there haven't been protests of this kind in Russia. So in fact, I would say the government, the Russian government, up until the war began, was much less repressive than Lukashenko's government, and Putin still enjoyed an unchallenged and uncontested status.
Wait, up here. You look like a student. Are you? Really?
Don Ziegler is my name. You mentioned the protests about the landfill in New York and the park in Moscow. There's a group I haven't heard much about, the mothers of those who have been lost and wounded in the war. I've heard them times, but is this a possible growing movement? So, the Kremlin that might be gain support among people?
The short answer is no. There was a very powerful movement of soldiers' mothers during the war in Chechnya, but that was a long, long time ago. This time around, when the war began, there was a movement of wives of servicemen. It was, I would say, generally loyal. They did not condemn Putin, and they did not demand that Putin resign, and did not have a leader of their own. What they were after was, they said that the government actually lied to us. We thought our husbands would fight and then come back, of course, those who would survive. And now it seems that they are there forever. Those who were mobilized forcefully at the time in the fall of 2022 that I mentioned, it was somehow assumed that they would not come back, but gradually it turned out. And there was a moment when a prominent lawmaker in the Russian parliament, a former general, actually said point blank in public that they are there until the end of the war. And that was when the movement of servicemen's wives, or they called themselves the wives of the mobilized, actually rose. The government was reasonably tolerant, seeing them as women with a kind of a right cause, but it did everything to clamp down in a kind of patient and slow way. And even at the height of their activity, when they held rallies in Moscow, and those rallies were never brought together like thousands of people. But some people joined them and shared their cause. The Kremlin started with actually harassing the leader, a woman who was the self-proclaimed leader of the group, and then pressing on her harder and harder. And in the end, this movement somehow dissipated. But it never enjoyed nationwide support for the very reason that this war is waged not by those who are mobilized. They account for a very small minority. There is still an opportunity for the majority in Russia to, as I said, to avert their gaze. This is not our war. Those who fight, they volunteered. The government paid them and they volunteered. Of course, those who volunteered are unfortunate people who are usually greatly indebted and often good for nothing, and people who cannot provide for their families. And sometimes you hear stories of women even encouraging those good for nothing husbands to volunteer. Our neighbor's husband was killed and now she's driving in a car. There were stories like that. But there is an opportunity for those in large urban centers, for the middle class in Russia, to somehow comfort. I'm not sure if they do, but there is an opportunity for them to comfort themselves by saying those people who are killed, they have not been mobilized. They volunteers. They wanted big money for that.
You know, part of what's been so terrific about having you at Northwestern is that you have such a deep knowledge of the sources and the analysts that are sending out information. Do you have suggestions for those of us out in the non-Russian speaking world, for reporters or journalists or others who we should keep an eye on in order to understand better the situation?
Thank you. This is a huge problem these days. There used to be so many excellent experts, Russian and foreign, and people who collaborated and studied the Russian society, which is of most interest to me as a Russian. And this is all over. And there were tons of very interesting publications, very insightful. These days, when, as I said at the beginning of my talk, the Russian society has become all but inaccessible to scholars, to social scientists, this is a huge problem. And those who have done this for a long time are in a privileged situation because they can rely on their experience. And they have a better knowledge of how to reach data that is otherwise unreachable for young ones. And I think many of you know that graduate students do not choose Russia as their field, or at least add something to Russia as their field, because they cannot go there. So instead of studying just Russia, the Russian society, Russian politics, what have you, they study Russia and Central Asia, and Russia and Eastern Europe, because it is impossible to get there. And I see, especially senior scholars who have gained huge experience with studying the Russian society and the Russian politics, Russian economy as well, are in a privileged situation because they can rely on their experience and they know how to find data that is otherwise, well, if not fully hidden, but harder to get. So I quoted Samuel Green, which a sociologist, an American sociologist working both in Britain and the United States, who has studied the Russian society for 20 plus years, I think, has excellent Russian. And it is not accidental that I quoted him because I see him as one of the most insightful students of the Russian society. He's done books, he publishes articles, he gives talks, he's easy to find on the web. And, you know, for those who are interested, I would strongly recommend to read what he writes. And he's written quite a bit lately based on, you know, this illusion or this hope against hope that something is changing the Russian society and maybe Putin's regime is not as stable as it was up until the beginning of this year.
Well, Masha, thank you so much for this. Thank you for everything that you've been contributing to Northwestern. We're so thrilled to have you here. I want to thank also the Buffett Institute for organizing this event and helping with your appointments here and the International Studies program in Weinberg as well. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you all.